When we last left our heroes, the North had discovered that the South was going to be a much more difficult nut to crack than they had anticipated. The blockade was somewhat tightening on the South, but the North had yet to really win a decisive victory, and the South was learning that the North could take several punches and keep coming based on their superior resources, and that their commitment to the conflict might have been better or larger than the South had anticipated. So, today we're going to continue to look at the North's attempts to find a general who's willing to effectively fight. We remember McClellan was really good at getting his army into position, but really bad at pulling the trigger and actually attacking. And we're going to go out to the West, where the story is very different than the war in Virginia so far. So, the Mid War and the Homefront today. The Union Army really searched for leaders, or struggled to find solid leaders. We had talked about one of the main advantages that the South had was that they had this long-standing tradition of military quality. And so the South had tons of effective generals, whereas the North, not so much. So McClellan gets relieved of command after his failure to follow up after the Battle of Antietam. That was the really bloody battle that ended up being a stalemate and blunting Lee's sort of first foray into the North. Well, after that battle, McClellan probably could have followed up and crushed Lee's army, but again, he had that same sort of insecurity where he felt like, well, I'm outnumbered, clearly I can't do anything. So he gets fired and is replaced by one of his subordinates, Ambrose Burnside, which is a fantastic name, and also one of the reasons that we call the sort of facial hair that he has sideburns, because, I mean, wow. So Burnside is a much more harder charging general, so he leads a foray south, and he just gets absolutely crushed by Lee at Fredericksburg. He gets tricked and outmaneuvered by Lee. You can see he crosses over a river, only to find Lee entrenched on the hills above, and launches a massive attack, which is repelled, and he's forced to retreat in disgrace. And so Burnside is then fired and replaced by a guy named Joe Hooker, who is more of a general in the mold of McClellan, and he basically makes the exact same mistake. So, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Hooker crosses the river and then more or less sits in place as Stonewall Jackson is able to steal a march around behind him, and then suddenly his army gets attacked from both sides. And so, routed, Hooker's army is also forced to retreat out of Virginia, and what you end up getting is, again, sort of the restoring the status quo in the East, in that the South isn't powerful enough to launch an attack to really damage the North, but every time the North ventures anywhere into Virginia, Lee bloodies their nose pretty badly. So, status quo maintaining in the East. And the Union Army is going to fire Joe Hooker, and is going to continue to struggle to find a leader who can actually fight. So, talking about leaders who can actually fight, we're going to transition out to the war in the West. The goal in the West was pretty straightforward. Make sure you keep the Ohio River, take the Mississippi River, and try to cut the South in half. What we end up getting from this is General Ulysses Grant starts taking important rivers, important tributaries along the Tennessee River, and takes the city of Cairo, which is at sort of the juncture between the Ohio River and the Mississippi. And so he's going to be trying to take these important river crossings, and it's here that Grant really starts to get his name as a quality general and fighter. He also gets his nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant because when he was attacking Fort Donelson, and the commanding general sent a missive to him asking for what terms he would accept in terms of surrender, he sent back this reply stating, quote, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." And so this is where Grant gets his nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant, and he's going to continue demanding these terms for the rest of the war. So the battle where Grant really becomes famous is the Battle of Shiloh. So he's marching south along sort of the Mississippi River, and he ends up facing off against a relatively large Southern army. He's able to bring in reinforcements. You can see here he's continuing to move along the Tennessee River before he cuts over to the Mississippi. And so he brings a significant numerical advantage to the battlefield, and it's in Shiloh, and it's of course more complicated than this, but in Shiloh he really starts to use his tactics of attrition, which is what he's most known for. What Grant has is he has far more troops and more supplies than his opponents. And so his strategy is pretty straightforward. Continual forward attacks until the Southerners are forced to retreat, and then he continues to press his advantage. And so at Shiloh, we're going to see Grant take almost unprecedented casualties up to this point, but because he has so many more troops to spare, he's able to launch counterattack after counterattack until the Southern lines finally break. And so Shiloh is where he develops what he's probably best known for, is this strategy of attrition, and where he's winning decisive battles against the Southerners, as opposed to in the East, where General Lee is more or less crushing any Union general who shows up against him. Here's your Battle of Shiloh. You can see overwhelming numbers charging, of course. And the end result is that Ulysses Grant starts to appear on the radar of the powers that be in Washington as someone who might be a more effective general than what they've had so far. But for right now, he's still bogged down in the West, and so they don't want to necessarily ship him off until his job here is complete. And so here's Ulysses Grant, for those of you who don't know him. He's an interesting character, and we'll get more into him later, especially once he becomes a political figure. But yeah. The other battle that Grant is famous for is the Siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the final sort of Confederate port on the Mississippi River. And so this is an incredibly bloody campaign and siege. Grant uses his traditional tactics to take heavy casualties but still push the Confederate army back towards Vicksburg, because even though he's taking about equal losses to the Confederates, the Confederates usually have fewer troops to spare, and so they don't feel like they can hold the position, and they keep withdrawing back to Vicksburg. And so then Grant sets up a siege surrounding Vicksburg, puts gunboats in the Mississippi River around Vicksburg, and slowly tightens the noose. The siege itself took a significant amount of time. We're talking months, and the garrison in Vicksburg eventually started to starve and struggle, and sickness was a main issue and things like that. Grant did try several major assaults on the city, but all of them were repulsed with massive casualties. But again, Grant has casualties to spare. Finally, he prepares to launch his final assault, where he orders his troops to dig tunnels under the Southern defenses and places ridiculous amounts of gunpowder and dynamite underneath the Southern lines, prepared to detonate it all, or as much of it as possible at once, and then launch a final assault. But before the final assault can happen, Southern morale breaks down within Vicksburg, and the city is surrendered to the Union Army. This gives the North a full control over the Mississippi River, cuts the South off from the valuable agricultural producing regions, which are mostly west of the Mississippi, and is one of the major turning points in the war up to this point. On the home front, the Civil War was a war that really transformed American society in a variety of ways. Obviously, the North had significantly more resources than the South, as we talked about earlier, and the Union blockade, as it slowly sort of strangled the South, and as Grant, of course, was able to take the Mississippi River, cutting off Arkansas and Louisiana, and was able to sort of squeeze the South down, things got pretty dire there. But in the North, they had to take pretty drastic steps to continue to fight this war also. For example, Lincoln reestablished a sort of makeshift national bank and then used that to print significant amounts of money to fund the war effort. This was sort of a new thing in American history, although it had happened in other places. But these new greenbacks, this money that was backed theoretically by nothing, but our faith in the federal government, helped finance the war effort, but for critics, they argued it would lead to inflation. And after the war, one of the main priorities was to get these greenbacks out of circulation and get and reestablish a sort of solid metallic standard for the money. We also saw a relatively high protective tariff from the North in order to continue to protect American manufacturing, which of course you would expect. And as we mentioned before, the Republicans were running on sort of an American System 2.0 plan, so it makes complete sense that they would embrace things like the national bank and a protective tariff. We also get, as part of the whole platform, the Homestead Act of 1862, which encouraged people to move out west and to settle in lands that had not yet been settled by farmers at this point. And so the Homestead Act allowed farmers to get somewhere in the area of, in the first round, I think 160 acres, and all they had to do was agree to live on the land for 3 years and improve it. And eventually that was doubled, and more land was given, especially in areas that were not quite as fertile. So the Homestead Act allowed people to settle out on the plains in much larger numbers than we'd seen before. And of course, this is going to lead to some significant conflict with Native Americans who had already settled on the plains and were relatively happy not having their land taken over for farming. So we see this wave of settlers going out west, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this next unit. The Pacific Railway Act was another component of Lincoln's sort of domestic policy. The goal, of course, is to create a transcontinental railroad. And as you remember, there was a debate about whether or not that transcontinental railroad would go through the north or go through the south. Well, the Civil War really solved that problem because obviously, if the South is currently in rebellion, you're not going to be building a transcontinental railroad. But the Pacific Railway Act paved the way for this transcontinental railroad through the north by giving land grants to railroads in order to finance the construction of this. And so a railroad company would say, yeah, I'm going to build this stretch of the transcontinental railroad, and the U.S. government would give them a grant of land along the railroad that they could then sell to people for a profit to finance the construction of this railroad. And so although it would be another about 5 years before the 9 years before the Transcontinental Railroad was 7 years? I think I'm gonna say 7 years before the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. The Pacific Railway Act paved the way for its construction. We also got the creation of land grant universities. This was another part of the whole Republican platform. Land grant universities were public universities that were established under what's called the Morrill Land Grant Act. It provided land for universities to sell in order to, again, finance the construction of these universities. And the only real condition was that they had to dedicate a portion of their academic studies to agricultural practices in order to try to increase efficiency out on the plains. And so there's too many to look to specifically point at here, but under the the Morrill Land Grant Act, all of the universities listed on this map were founded. You'll notice it's a significant portion of the major universities out in the west, and also some other universities in the east that already existed expanded significantly by providing for agricultural studies. So around here, Missouri, Kansas State, and Nebraska were all land grant universities, and more or less all of the Big Ten and a significant portion of the Big 12 was as well. A significant portion of the Big 12 and the SEC. The roles of women changed during the war the same way the roles of women often change. Of course, because men have to go off to war and do the majority of the fighting. We do get an expanded role for women. In the North, that meant women had to go work in factories, or were allowed to go work in factories in order to replace the men who had left. And in the South, women have to take over a lot of the sort of agricultural jobs that men had left behind. So taking over a lot of farming, running plantations, things like that. This, of course, increases sort of the social and economic power of women. And although after the war, a lot of that progress would be eroded, women would gain some ground, as they do in most conflicts up until this point. So the North is profoundly transformed, the South is slowly being squeezed and constricted, and afterwards, a lot of these changes that had happened are going to be maintained throughout the whole next unit. And so although there will be some demilitarization after the war, a lot of the things that were put in place are going to continue to affect American society going forward.